Alright everybody, so we still have a few really exciting projects to create in this course, one of which is this flamethrower setup. So nothing really too new here. If you've been following the course, as always, you probably know how to do this by now. So we just have some particle flow particles emitting fuel, and that fuel is then igniting and generating smoke. And I played with the shader to get some nice red color toward the end and some nice orangey fiery color in the beginning. Everything that we've covered. So as always, I would like to challenge you to just pause the video and see if you can set this up on your own. But if you're not sure, no problem, let's set it up from scratch. So I am working in units, centimeters. One unit is 10 centimeters right now. And I'm just gonna go under standard particle systems and create a PF source like we did many times. And let's rotate it 90 degrees and raise it slightly above the ground. So something like this should work. And let's go into the particle view. And we basically wanted to keep emitting forever. So I'm gonna say emit stop, maybe, 11,000, some random number. And we can emit at a rate of 500 particles per frame. So we have something like this. I'm gonna delete rotation as always and delete shape. And I'm gonna give it a delete operator. And I want the particles to live for about 10 frames with no variation. So this is a super simple emitter setup that we have right now. And again, you can just click on the PF source node and say that you wanna see 100% of the particles in the viewport. In the integration step, I'm gonna say 1/4 frame. And one more thing before I forget, let's give it a speed of about 1,000 instead of 3,000 so they're not too fast. So this looks pretty good, and maybe it's a bit too thick, so I'm gonna hit R and just make this a bit of a thinner flow. Next, as always, let's create a source and add the particles as our source. Say OK. Outgoing velocity can stay at 100 centimeters. We don't want any temperature or smoke, but we are gonna emit fuel. And I wanna do a motion velocity of 3 because I really wanna push that fuel out based on the speed of the particles. And then let's create a standard Phoenix grid. And let's go under the grid settings, give it a bit more resolution. And we can say adaptive grid by temperature with maybe a 500 degree threshold with 5 for the margin, and therefore we can maybe just shrink this down a little bit and just let the adaptive grid expand as it needs to. And let's do maximum expansion just so we can control this a little bit, so we don't need any -Z. On +Z, maybe I want it to go this high up the furthest and this far on the Y, doesn't need to go back. And the X, maybe it can just go about this wide if it needs to. This is sort of the project of 0.5. I found 0.5 worked pretty well for everything here. So we can do cooling 0.5, smoke dissipation 0.5. We can do fuel buoyancy, we're gonna do -3. So one of the challenges of this setup is that the hot temperature of the fuel wants to push the fire upwards right away. But we kind of wanna get this almost dragon breath, elongated fire, so pushing the fuel to the ground by making the buoyancy -3 allowed me to get that effect. Then we can do 0.5 for all of this vorticity here, and I'm gonna do PCG symmetric with 50 quality for the conservation, and let's do steps per frame 2. And under fuel, let's enable burning and do ignition temperature of 290. We can do 5 for energy. Fuel depletion, I did 4. So again, this controls how quickly the fuel burns out. So if the fuel depletion was less, the fire would maybe last much longer and burn all the way into the corner here. But instead, I kind of wanted it to die like this. So a value of 4 worked well for that. 1 for this, smoke amount, 1 for smoke threshold, and propagation we can leave at 0. We don't really need any kind of explosiveness. Under output, let's just output fuel and velocity. So I'm running the sim and I can tell that the general setup is pretty good, but we need to play with the shader to get this to look nicer. So I'm gonna stop the sim and go under rendering volumetric options. And now we need to play with this to bring up some of that fire back in. So actually what I ended up doing in my example is I lowered the physically based, and that allows me to bring back a lot of the fire and the smoke. So I made this around 0.6. Then let's raise the fire multiplier to 5. And I'm gonna just drag this point back, and you can see that really brings back a lot of that fire. And you can just double click and make a point and raise this up, and then maybe make another one and raise this up as well. So now we need to just sort of play with this curve like we're used to bring back a lot of that fire. So maybe something like this, and you can just drag this back, and you can just drag through the timeline to see. All right, so I guess this is a pretty good flamethrower already. I really like how some of the flames end up living all the way back here, and you can always just play with this. And then I would just play with the colors again. So let's do like a much darker red for the end of the flames here. So the lower temperatures is what we're controlling. So maybe something like this. And I would maybe do almost like a pure white, like a much brighter color back here. And maybe push it more into the orange territory, something like this. So I'd say that I'm pretty happy with this. And then you can go into the smoke color and make that darker. And you can go into the smoke opacity and raise that up. So that looks pretty good. I would maybe try in different modes. So let's do based on temperature. I kind of love that look of that thick smoke. And you can always just play with the graph to control the opacity, but I would say that maybe this looks pretty good. So you can just go back under the fire here, and maybe let's do power on scene 5. And I'm gonna just do a test render to see what this looks like. So as usual, I would just do standard V-Ray plane to give us some ground. Just make it almost pure black, something like this, and put my camera in place, and let's run a test render and see what this looks like. All right, I would say this is not too bad for first test render here. I think we need to add a bit more variation in the color for the flames, and we need to add a light source to illuminate the smoke. So let me just go under lights, V-Ray, and let's just drag out a standard V-Ray light. Maybe give it a multiplier of 3 and put it sort of above the flamethrower because we want to see some nice light hitting the smoke there. Add a bit more color to this whole gradient because I want to see more variation. So maybe I'm gonna do another sort of lighter color up here, and then I'm gonna do almost like a dark orange red color and drag these around until I get something that looks pretty good. All right, so it seems like dragging this range between 500 and 1000 Kelvin seems to be the most affected range of the whole flamethrower. So I'm just gonna play by placing the colors in here. And I kind of want to brighten up these hot spots. So I'm gonna raise this up. And maybe we can raise the entire fire multiplier to brighten up the entire fire. All right, so this looks pretty good. Let's remember that this is still super low res, so the quality of the fire is not too great, but I'm just trying to get the look right. All right, I would say that this is looking pretty good, very close to what I had in my example. So at this point, I would just go back under grid. And let's reduce the cell size, give us more resolution. So maybe we can do something like 4.5 centimeter cell size, and let's run the sim. All right, so we're getting some nice detail with the higher resolution. I think I'm just gonna make the smoke a darker color So go back under the smoke color settings and make it almost pure black. I just really like that gasoline smoke look. And then we can just lower the intensity of this light to maybe just 1 and put our camera in place. I'm gonna pause the simulation and run a final rendering. Alright, so this is our final flamethrower look. I would increase the resolution even more right now. I would probably just go back under grid and give us, as high as 10 million total cells. So maybe I would do something like 2.5 centimeter cell size. That should give you some really beautiful detail. And then you can still brighten the fire up even more by going under the volumetric options and just playing with the fire multiplier. So maybe you can make that 10. And you can play with this curve to brighten up those areas even more. So then when you render it out, you should get something along these lines, and you can always just add some curve, some contrast in After Effects, and you can play with the hue color correction to adjust the color. But this is it. The project file is under the video as always. Just want to remind you guys, and I'll see you in the next lesson.